Forget the storybook princess. This isn't a tale of tiaras, it's a battle for identity. Erase the image of a life lived in perfect, effortless grace. Because for some, the weight of a crown they never asked to wear is not a privilege, but a prison. For some, the blood that runs through their veins, royal, revered, almost sacred, feels less like a blessing and more like a brand. This is the story of Lady Helen Taylor. The world would come to know her as the wild child of Windsor, the royal rebel with a dark past. They saw the parties, the rock stars, the scandalous headlines that screamed of drugs and disgrace. But what they didn't see was the girl underneath it all, a girl desperately trying to outrun her own shadow, a shadow cast by the most famous family on earth. This is the story of a rebellion, not against a monarchy, but against a destiny. A story of a woman who tried to escape her own bloodline, only to discover that some cages are not made of iron bars, but of history, duty, and a name you can never truly leave behind. To understand the rebel, you must first understand the world that created her. Lady Helen Marina Lucy Windsor was born on the 28th of April, 1964. And 1964 wasn't just any year in Britain. It was the epicenter of a cultural earthquake. The post-war gloom that had shrouded the nation for nearly 2 decades was finally lifting, replaced by a dazzling, dizzying explosion of color, sound, and youthful defiance. This was swinging London, a city shedding its stiff upper lip for the miniskirt, a nation where the Beatles were bigger than the Prime Minister, and where the rigid class structures that had defined British society for centuries were beginning to crack. It was an age of profound social change, a time when deference to the establishment was no longer a given. The Profumo affair just a year earlier had rocked the political elite, proving that even the most powerful were fallible, their secrets vulnerable to exposure. A new generation was rising, and they weren't asking for permission. They were questioning everything: politics, sex, art, and the very idea of tradition itself. But inside the palaces, it was still 1954. The House of Windsor, the very symbol of that establishment being challenged, was an institution built on continuity, not revolution. While the world outside was erupting in a riot of self-expression, life within the royal fold was governed by a strict, unspoken code of conduct. It was a world of protocol, of duty, of putting the institution before the individual, always. Queen Elizabeth II, a young monarch herself, was navigating this new, uncertain landscape with a quiet, steely resolve. Her duty was to remain above the fray, to be a constant, unchanging symbol in a world that was changing at breakneck speed. This created a profound disconnect. While her subjects were exploring newfound freedoms, her own family was expected to embody a timeless, almost mythical ideal of British propriety. It was into this strange paradox, a nation hurtling towards the future and a family anchored firmly in the past, that Helen was born. Her father was Prince Edward, the Duke of Kent. Not a household name like Prince Charles, but a significant figure nonetheless. He was a first cousin to the Queen herself, his father having been the younger brother of King George VI. This placed Helen, at the time of her birth, 13th in the line of succession. She was undeniably royal, a true Windsor, part of the inner circle. Her father was the epitome of the family creed, duty. A career soldier, he spent over 2 decades in the British Army, serving in conflicts and embodying the stoic, service-oriented spirit of his generation. He was a man of discipline, tradition, and quiet dignity. Her mother, Catherine Worsley, the Duchess of Kent, was a different soul altogether. Hailing from a family of Yorkshire landed gentry, she was known for her warmth, her grace, and a deep, abiding passion for music. But she also possessed a sensitive and at times fragile spirit that struggled with the rigid confines and relentless scrutiny of royal life. Later in life, she would speak openly about her battles with depression and her decision to convert to Catholicism, a deeply personal journey that set her apart from the royal mainstream. So Helen's inheritance was twofold. From her father, the unyielding expectation of duty and the weight of the Windsor name. From her mother, a sensitive artistic temperament and a glimpse of the emotional toll that royal life could exact. It was a potent and potentially volatile combination. Helen's early years alongside her older brother George, Earl of St. Andrews, and later her younger brother, Lord Nicholas Windsor, were spent at Coppins, a sprawling country house in Buckinghamshire. On the surface, it was an idyllic childhood, insulated from the cares of the ordinary world. There were ponies, nannies, and vast grounds to explore. But this was not an ordinary family. This was the firm, as they are sometimes known. Every public appearance was choreographed. Every photograph was a statement. The pressure to be perfect, to be a credit to the family, was implicit in every interaction. For a child, this can be profoundly confusing. How do you learn who you are when your primary role is to be a symbol? How do you develop a sense of self when you are constantly being reminded that you are part of something much larger, something that demands your absolute conformity? Her education began at St. Mary's School in Wantage, an all-girls boarding school known for its strong academic and artistic programs. It was here, perhaps, that the first seeds of her independent spirit began to sprout. Away from the immediate orbit of the royal family, she was exposed to a wider range of influences and friendships. She excelled in the arts, showing a natural flair for creativity and a keen eye for aesthetics. This artistic sensibility was a lifeline, a way to express the burgeoning individuality that the rigid structure of her life sought to contain. But it was her next school that would prove to be a defining and perhaps a deeply challenging experience. At 16, she followed in the footsteps of her royal cousins, Prince Charles, Andrew, and Edward, and was sent to Gordonstoun in Scotland. Gordonstoun was not your typical British public school. Founded by the German educationalist Kurt Hahn, its philosophy was rooted in the idea that character was forged through challenge, adversity, and physical endurance. It was famous for its punishingly cold morning showers, its grueling expeditions into the Scottish Highlands, and its emphasis on self-reliance. Prince Charles, who had attended years earlier, famously detested the place, writing in letters home that it was colditz in kilts. He felt bullied, isolated, and miserable. Now imagine sending a young woman like Helen, artistic, sensitive, and already feeling the constraints of a prescribed life, into this hyper-masculine, Spartan environment. The school had only recently become co-educational, and the culture was still overwhelmingly one of toughing it out, of suppressing emotion in favor of stoic endurance. For Helen, it must have felt like trading one gilded cage for another, more rugged one. The experience, by all accounts, was not a happy one. While the school prided itself on building leaders, its methods could be crushing for those who didn't fit the mold. The emphasis on conformity and rugged discipline was the very antithesis of the creative, expressive world she was naturally drawn to. It's been said that it was during her time at Gordonstoun that she earned the nickname Melons, a cruel, childish taunt about her developing figure that followed her into the tabloids years later. It was a stark introduction to the brutal reality of public scrutiny, the way a name or a body could be turned into a weapon against you. This experience likely solidified a core belief within her. that the established path, the one laid out for her by family and tradition, was not her own. Gordonstoun was meant to mold her into a compliant, resilient member of the establishment. Instead, it may have done the opposite. It may have been the very crucible that forged her resolve to break free, to seek out a world that valued not what she was born into, but who she chose to be. It was a world of art, of music, of rebellion, and it was waiting for her in London. After leaving school, the path of a minor royal was usually clear: a quiet university degree, a respectable job in the arts or charity sector, a suitable marriage, and a life of cutting ribbons and attending garden parties. But Helen Windsor was about to tear up the royal rulebook. She wasn't interested in a life lived in the pale shadows of the throne. She was drawn to the bright, chaotic, and dangerous lights of a different kind of kingdom. The sprawling, electrifying urban jungle of 1980s London. She was about to step out of the wings and onto a stage of her own making, a stage where the rules were different, the risks were higher, and the fall could be infinitely more painful. Her great escape was about to begin. Having been forged in the rigid, unforgiving crucible of Gordonstoun, Helen Windsor stood at a crossroads. Behind her lay a childhood defined by protocol and expectation. Ahead lay the vast, alluring chaos of 1980s London. This was not merely a move from the countryside to the city. It was a conscious, deliberate flight towards anonymity and self-invention. She was not just seeking a new home. She was seeking a new identity, one she could build from the ground up, far from the suffocating shadow of the crown. London in the 1980s was a city at war with itself. It was a decade of division, of boom and bust, of gritty social realism clashing with glamorous, unapologetic excess. For a young woman fresh from the rigid, windswept isolation of Gordonstoun, stepping into this chaotic technicolor metropolis must have felt like landing on another planet. This was not the London of royal processions and polite society that she knew. This was a city of possibility, a sprawling canvas where you could reinvent yourself, lose yourself, and, if you were very lucky, find yourself. For Helen Windsor, it was the perfect place to begin her great escape. Her first act of rebellion wasn't loud or scandalous. It was quiet, practical, and profound. She got a job, not a ceremonial role or a position at a family-approved charity, but a real 9-to-5 job in the heart of London's burgeoning contemporary art scene. She took a position at a prestigious gallery, working for a man who would become a pivotal figure in her life, the art dealer Karsten Schubert. Karsten Schubert was not an establishment figure, a German émigré. He was a key player in the avant-garde, known for his sharp intellect, his uncompromising taste, and for championing some of the most cutting-edge artists of the day. His gallery wasn't a place for stuffy aristocrats looking for a pleasant watercolor. It was a hub for the young British artists' movement, a place of serious intellectual and artistic ferment. For Helen to choose this environment was a powerful statement. She was aligning herself not with the traditions of her past, but with the radical new ideas that were shaping the future of culture. For 13 years, she would work alongside Schubert, not as a royal dilettante, but as a dedicated professional. She started as a gallery assistant, answering phones, greeting clients, handling the unglamorous day-to-day tasks. But she was a quick study with a natural inherited eye for aesthetics. She rose to become a director at the gallery, respected for her insight, her connections, and her genuine passion. A former colleague from that time would later recall she never, ever played the royal card. She was just Helen. She wanted to be judged on her merit, on her work. People who came into the gallery who didn't know her background had no idea she was a member of the royal family. She was knowledgeable, She was professional, and she was incredibly cool. This job was her anchor. It gave her a purpose, a community, and an identity that was entirely her own. In the white-walled, minimalist space of the gallery, she wasn't Lady Helen, 20-something in line to the throne. She was Helen Windsor, art professional. This distinction was everything. It was the freedom she had craved. Here she was surrounded by people who were creating, questioning, and dismantling the old guard. They were her people, the artists, the thinkers, the provocateurs. They didn't care about her bloodline. They cared about her ideas, and as she carved out her professional identity, she was simultaneously crafting a powerful personal one. Helen embraced fashion not as a matter of royal protocol, but as a form of self-expression, as armor. She became a muse for designers, most notably Catherine Walker, a favorite of Princess Diana's. But where Diana's clothes often spoke a language of evolving royal elegance, Helen's choices were bolder, edgier. She understood the power of a silhouette, the statement of a sharp shoulder, or a dramatic neckline. She became a fixture on the London social scene, a regular in the columns of magazines like Tatler and Vogue. She wasn't just attending events, she was defining the look of an era. The press was fascinated. Here was a Windsor who was genuinely, effortlessly so. She didn't have the fairy tale narrative of Diana or the girl next door appeal of Sarah Ferguson. She had something else, an air of mystery, of intellectual chic, mixed with a rock and roll sensibility. They gave her a new nickname, one that captured this duality, Princess Posh. It was, for a time, a term of admiration. She was the royal you'd actually want to have a drink with, the one who knew the best bands and the coolest galleries. She moved into her own flat in a fashionable part of London. For the first time, she was truly independent, managing her own life, paying her own bills, and coming and going as she pleased. This newfound freedom was intoxicating. She was part of a glamorous, fast-moving set, a whirlwind of art openings, exclusive dinners, and late nights at members-only clubs like the Groucho Club in Soho. It was a world populated by celebrities, musicians, writers, and artists, people who lived by their own rules. And for a while, it seemed she had found the perfect balance, a respectable, high-flying career by day and a thrilling, glamorous social life by night. She had successfully escaped the gilded cage, or so it seemed, but a Windsor can never truly be anonymous. And the British tabloid press, at the height of its power and ferocity in the late 80s and early 90s, smells royal blood like sharks smell blood in the water. The very things that made Helen so fascinating, her independence, her cool detachment, her association with the edgy and the avant-garde, also made her a perfect target. The narrative began to shift, slowly at first, then with ruthless speed. The admiration for Princess Posh curdled into suspicion. Her chic independence was reframed as aloofness, her confidence as arrogance. The headlines started to carry a new, sharper edge. The nickname from her school days, Melons, was resurrected with a sneering, misogynistic glee. Every outfit was scrutinized, every public appearance dissected for signs of strain or scandal. The photographers became more aggressive, their lenses more intrusive. They were no longer just documenting her life, they were hunting her. The problem was that the world she had embraced, the world of art and rock music, was, to the conservative readership of the tabloids, synonymous with decadence and moral decay. Her friends were not landed gentry and safe aristocrats. They were people like the flamboyant record executive and creator of the Pet Shop Boys, Simon Napier Bell. She was once his PA, a job that plunged her even deeper into the hedonistic heart of the music industry. While it was another testament to her desire to work and forge her own path, the association was a red flag for the press. The late-night parties, the bohemian friends, the unapologetic enjoyment of a life lived on her own terms. It was all circumstantial evidence in the court of public opinion. They were building a case against her, waiting for her to slip up. This was the beginning of the wild child narrative. It was a carefully constructed media caricature, but like all effective caricatures, it was rooted in a kernel of truth. Helen was pushing boundaries. She was living a life that was radically different from any royal before her. She was, by her own admission, enjoying herself. In a rare interview years later, she reflected on this period with a certain frankness, saying, "I was a bit of a wild thing in my youth." But the media has no room for nuance. They needed a simple story, and the story they chose was that of a princess gone bad. Every night out was a wild bender. Every male friend was a mystery lover. Her artistic bohemian circle was reimagined as a dangerous drug-fueled coterie. They were laying a trap, painting a picture of her life that was so vivid, so sensational, that when the real crisis came, the public would be primed to believe the very worst. The psychological pressure must have been immense. The very freedom she had fought so hard to achieve was now the reason she was being condemned. The anonymity she had briefly enjoyed was gone, replaced by relentless, hostile surveillance. She was living under a microscope, her every move interpreted through the distorted lens of tabloid morality. The world she had built for herself, her sanctuary in the heart of London's creative scene, was being invaded. The escape was turning into a siege. The carefree confidence of her early 20s began to be replaced by a guarded, wary defensiveness. She had tried to create a life where her title didn't matter, but the media would never let her forget it. Lady Helen. The title was always there, a prefix that marked her as different, that held her to a standard she had no interest in meeting. The more she tried to just be Helen, the more loudly they shouted "Lady." The cage she thought she had left behind was reassembling itself around her, its bars now forged from newsprint and flashbulbs. The stage was set for a fall, and the British press was waiting impatiently in the wings, ready to document every moment of it. She had built a perfect life, balanced precariously between professional respectability and fashionable rebellion. But the foundation was more fragile than she knew. The media, having christened her the wild child, was no longer content to simply admire her from afar. They were now invested in the narrative, waiting, almost willing for the fall that would justify their headlines. The respect she had earned by day was being systematically eroded by the whispers that followed her at night. Pressure closed in, and the world she'd built began to crack. There is a moment in every siege when the walls are breached, a moment when the constant pressure, the relentless probing for weakness, finally finds a crack. For Lady Helen Windsor, that moment arrived in the early 1990s, the decade that began with so much promise for her, a successful career, a celebrated sense of style, a life lived on her own terms, was about to unravel in the most public and brutal way imaginable. The media, having spent years carefully crafting the wild child narrative, was no longer just watching and waiting. They were actively hunting for the story that would prove them right. And in the hothouse atmosphere of London's art and high society scene, a world fueled by money, ambition, and often cocaine, it was only a matter of time before they found it. The life that had been her liberation was about to become her undoing. The freedom she had cherished was revealed to be a beautifully disguised trap. The catalyst was a man named Shiv Puri. He was not a rock star or a degenerate aristocrat. He was, like Helen, a figure in the art world, an old Etonian and a well-connected art and antiques dealer, Puri moved in the same sophisticated, moneyed circles. He was charming, intelligent, and part of the glittering international set that floated between London, New York, and Gstaad. To Helen, he was simply a friend, another member of the tribe she had built for herself, a world away from the stuffy drawing rooms of her royal relatives. Their friendship was unremarkable within their social context. They attended the same parties, knew the same people, and shared a passion for the arts. But Puri, unbeknownst to many, was leading a double life. Behind the facade of a respectable dealer, he was also a significant player in a high society cocaine ring, supplying the drug to a wealthy clientele in the exclusive London neighborhoods of Chelsea and Belgravia. For the tabloid press, this was the missing piece of the puzzle. They had the motive, Helen's supposed rebellion. They had the character, the wild child of Windsor. All they needed was the crime, and through her association with Shiv Puri, they found it. It didn't matter that she wasn't the one dealing. It didn't matter what her level of involvement or non-involvement actually was. In the predatory logic of tabloid journalism, guilt by association is as good as a conviction. She was close to the fire, and they were ready to declare that she had been burned. In 1991, the dam finally broke. Shiv Puri was arrested, his sophisticated operation dismantled by the police. The story erupted, a firestorm of speculation and accusation. And at the very heart of that firestorm, the press placed Lady Helen. Her name was now inextricably linked to a major criminal investigation. The whispers and innuendo that had followed her for years had just been amplified into a deafening roar of public condemnation. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. She was for a time the most talked about woman in Britain for all the wrong reasons. A scrum of photographers and reporters camped outside her flat, turning her home into a prison. Every time she stepped outside, she was met with a wall of flashing lights and shouted questions. "Lady Helen, did you take cocaine? Were you involved in the drug ring? What does the Queen think?" Her life, the one she had so carefully constructed, was systematically dismantled on the front pages. Her career at the Karsten Schubert Gallery, a source of immense pride and professional validation, was now tainted by scandal. The art world, while outwardly liberal, is heavily dependent on the patronage of the very wealthy, and a scandal of this magnitude was toxic. The pressure on her, and on the gallery, was immense. Her circle of friends was fractured. Some stood by her, but others, fearful of being caught in the crossfire, quietly distanced themselves. She was experiencing the brutal social physics of a public shaming. The closer you are to the center of the scandal, the more isolated you become. And then came the moment she must have dreaded most. She was interviewed by the police as part of their investigation. While she was never charged with any crime, never arrested, the very fact of the interview was enough to cement the narrative in the public's mind. The headline wasn't "Royal Questioned and Cleared," it was "Royal Questioned." The nuance was lost, buried under an avalanche of sensationalism. She was crucified in a trial by media where there was no presumption of innocence, no right to reply, only the relentless daily churn of the news cycle, which demanded a villain. Imagine the psychological toll. This wasn't just public embarrassment. It was a fundamental violation of her identity. The world had taken her story, a complex narrative of a young woman trying to find her place, and flattened it into a sordid, one-dimensional tabloid cliché. There is a specific kind of powerlessness that comes from watching yourself be turned into a caricature, a symbol of everything you fought not to be. The stories from this period are harrowing. Friends spoke of her growing paranoia, of her belief that her phone was tapped, of her fear of leaving her own home. The pressure cooker of her life, combined with the genuine hedonism of the scene she was a part of, reportedly led to her own struggles with substance abuse. The wild child label, once a media invention, was now threatening to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. This wasn't just youthful partying anymore. This was a young woman in crisis, self-medicating against the unbearable strain of her public life, a life she could no longer control. And where was the palace in all of this? The royal family's traditional response to scandal is a wall of silence. Never complain, never explain. It is a strategy designed to preserve the mystique and dignity of the monarchy. But for an individual in the eye of the storm, that silence can feel like abandonment. While senior royals might have benefited from the formidable press machine of Buckingham Palace, Helen, as a minor royal, was more exposed, more vulnerable. The institution she was born into, adhering to its traditional silence in the face of scandal, never complain, never explain, offered no public shield, leaving her seemingly exposed. She was left to face the storm alone. This was her nadir, a point of profound personal and public crisis. She had tried to escape her bloodline, only to find it had made her a bigger target than she could have ever imagined. She had built a world of her own, only to watch it crumble under the weight of scandal. She was lost, isolated, and publicly branded. It would have been easy at this point for her story to end in tragedy. But sometimes, in the darkest of moments, a different path reveals itself. A lifeline appears. For Helen, that lifeline was a man named Timothy Taylor. He was not a stranger to her world. An art dealer himself, the son of a decorated Royal Air Force commander, he moved in similar circles. But he was different. Where her life had been a whirlwind of chaotic energy, he was a center of calm. Where others were drawn to her for her title or her rebellious image, he was drawn to the woman underneath. They met, and in him, Helen found something that had been conspicuously absent from her life, a sense of safety. He was a man who understood the world she came from, both the art world and the world of the British establishment, but he was not defined or damaged by it. He saw past the headlines, past the wild child caricature, and saw the intelligent, sensitive, and wounded woman at the heart of the storm. Their relationship began quietly, away from the glare of the cameras that still followed her every move. It wasn't a whirlwind romance. It was a slow, steady process of building trust. He was her anchor in the storm, and he would become her way out. The escape she had been searching for all along wasn't from her family, but from the chaos she had fallen into. And it was love, not rebellion, that would finally show her the way. At the absolute nadir of her public and private life, branded, isolated, and facing the wreckage of the identity she had fought to create, Helen found an unexpected anchor. The arrival of Timothy Taylor in her life was more than just a romance. It was a quiet offer of an alternative future. It was a path away from the noise, the scandal, and the relentless judgment. For a woman who had been running towards the fire for a decade, this was a chance to finally turn away from the flames and begin the slow, difficult work of rebuilding from the ashes. It was a choice not of surrender, but of profound self-preservation. Redemption doesn't always arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it comes quietly, a gradual dawn after a long and violent night. For Lady Helen Windsor, the path out of the wreckage of her public life was not paved with grand gestures or public apologies. It was built, day by day, through the quiet, steadfast architecture of a loving relationship. Timothy Taylor wasn't just a suitor. He was a sanctuary. In a world that had become hostile and predatory, he offered her the rare gift of unconditional acceptance. He saw the woman, not the headline, Their courtship was a study in discretion. It unfolded away from the flashbulbs, in the quiet corners of London that were still her own. Private dinners, weekends in the country, visits to galleries after hours. This was not a relationship for public consumption. It was a slow, careful process of healing. He provided the stability she needed to begin piecing her life back together, not by telling her what to do, but by creating a space where she could simply be. For a woman who had spent a decade performing, whether as the chic art world insider or the rebellious wild child, the freedom to be vulnerable, to be tired, to be uncertain, was perhaps the greatest freedom of all. He understood the pressures she faced because he was adjacent to her world, yet not consumed by it. As an art dealer, he respected her professional acumen. As the son of a high-ranking military officer, he understood the culture of duty and expectation she came from. He was the perfect bridge between the two conflicting halves of her identity, the Windsor and the rebel. With him, she didn't have to choose. She could just be Helen. She married art dealer Timothy Taylor on the 18th of July, 1992, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor Castle. The choice of venue was itself a statement. It was not Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's Cathedral. It was grand, but on a human scale. It was a place of deep historical and architectural significance, befitting a royal, but it was not a stage for a global television spectacle. This was a wedding, not a coronation. Everything about the day felt like a deliberate recalibration. Her dress, designed by her friend Catherine Walker, was a masterpiece of understated elegance. With its wide, dramatic neckline and sleek silhouette, it was undeniably high fashion, a nod to the woman she had become. But its classicism and grace also spoke of tradition, of a return to a more timeless sense of style. It was the perfect synthesis of her two worlds. As she walked down the aisle, she was not just a bride. She was a woman publicly and gracefully turning a page. The guest list was a testament to the life she had lived. The Queen was there, as were the Queen Mother and Princess Diana, a quiet signal of family support after a period of intense turmoil. But alongside the royal contingent were the figures from her other life, artists, gallery owners, designers, the very people who had formed her tribe during her London years. It was a symbolic unification, a declaration that she was not abandoning who she was, but integrating all the parts of herself into a new, more stable whole. The wedding was an act of profound optimism. It was a bet on a future defined not by scandal, but by partnership. It was her first decisive step out of the wilderness. But marriage was not an endpoint. It was a beginning. The true work of rebuilding a life, of creating a fortress of privacy against the world, had just begun. Helen and Timothy Taylor made a conscious, strategic decision to withdraw. This was not a retreat born of shame, but a powerful act of self-preservation. They moved into a comfortable family home, and Helen's focus shifted dramatically. The late nights at the Groucho Club were replaced by the rhythms of domestic life, and soon her life was given a new, all-encompassing purpose: motherhood. In 1994, their first son, Columbus George Donald Taylor, was born. He was followed by Cassius Edward Taylor in 1996, a daughter, Eloise Olivia Catherine Taylor, in 2003, and finally another daughter, Estella Olga Elizabeth Taylor, in 2004. For Helen, becoming a mother was a transformation. It recalibrated her entire existence. The anxieties of public perception, the sting of tabloid headlines, all of it paled in comparison to the fierce protective love she felt for her children. Her new role provided an unshakable anchor. Her identity was no longer defined by the press or by her royal lineage in the same way. She was, first and foremost, a mother. This role gave her a powerful, unimpeachable reason to demand privacy. It was no longer just about her own comfort. It was about creating a normal, safe, and nurturing environment for her children, an environment blessedly free from the intrusive glare of the camera lens that had so damaged her own youth. She was determined that her children would not pay the price for her name. She became a master of the quiet life. She was rarely seen at official royal events, limiting her appearances to major family occasions like Trooping the Color or significant weddings. She gave no tell-all interviews, wrote no memoirs. She simply disappeared from the news cycle. The press, deprived of the drama they fed on, eventually, for the most part, left her alone. The wild child narrative died a quiet death from lack of fuel. This retreat into domesticity did not mean an abandonment of her own passions. On the contrary, it allowed her to engage with the art world on her own terms. For years, she worked as a brand ambassador for Giorgio Armani, a role that perfectly suited her refined aesthetic and deep understanding of style. It was a public-facing role, but one that she could control, centered on her professional expertise rather than her personal life. The press called her the Armani Queen, a nickname that, unlike its predecessors, spoke of respect for her taste and influence. She also continued to work as an art consultant, a respected and discreet figure in a world she knew so intimately. Her professional life continued to thrive, but it did so behind the scenes. She had learned a crucial lesson from her tumultuous youth, that it was possible to have a meaningful career and a public profile without sacrificing your private soul. The key was control. She now controlled the narrative by simply refusing to participate in the media's game. This period of her life represents a profound maturation. The rebellious energy of her 20s didn't simply vanish, it was transmuted. The desire to break free from convention was channeled into creating an unconventional family life, one that prized privacy and normalcy despite its royal connections. The fierce independence that once led her to London's rock clubs was now directed towards protecting her children from the very forces that had once threatened to destroy her. She hadn't been tamed, as some early cynical headlines suggested. She had evolved. She had taken the shattered pieces of her public and private selves and forged them into a new identity, one that was stronger, wiser, and infinitely more resilient. She had, in her own quiet way, won. She had escaped the narrative the world had tried to write for her, and had at last authored her own. And so, the rebel found her peace. Through a conscious and disciplined withdrawal from the public gaze, she achieved a victory that was quiet, personal, and absolute. She had successfully navigated the storm and built a life of meaning and privacy. But to fully understand the significance of her journey, we must step back from the personal narrative. Her story is more than just the biography of one woman. It is a vital chapter in the modern history of the royal family and the culture of celebrity. To truly grasp her legacy, we must examine the arguments that her life provoked and the profound implications of her struggle. So what becomes of a royal rebel after the war is over? What does life look like when the cameras turn away and the headlines fade? For Lady Helen Taylor, the answer is a life of curated quietude. She exists, she thrives, but she does so largely in the public's peripheral vision, a place she has meticulously carved out for herself. She is still a Windsor, a great-granddaughter of a king, a cousin to a monarch, but she is by her own design no longer a public spectacle. Today she is a respected figure in the art and fashion worlds, a patron of charities like the CLIC, Sargent Children's Cancer Charity, a role she took over from her father. She is a wife of over 3 decades and the mother of 4 grown children. By any measure, her life is a success story, a testament to stability, enduring love, and personal resilience. She has achieved the normalcy she once seemed to crave so desperately. And yet, the ghost of her past has a long shadow. She may have escaped the daily scrutiny, but she has not, and perhaps never will, escape the narrative. Even now, decades later, when her name appears in the press, it is rarely without a familiar, coded descriptor: former wild child, once notorious royal. Vogue magazine, the one-time chronicler of her cutting-edge style, once referred to her as the royal rebel with a dark past. The label, it seems, is permanent. It is a quiet but persistent reminder of the girl she was and of the brutal public trial that defined her youth. This persistence raises a crucial, complex question. How should history remember Lady Helen? Was she truly the author of her own misfortune, or was she the victim of an impossible inheritance? There are 2 distinct ways to interpret Lady Helen's story, and both contain a measure of truth. The first argument, and perhaps the most sympathetic, is that she was a casualty of a deeply dysfunctional system. She was born into the gilded cage of minor royalty, a strange purgatory where you carry all the burdens of a famous name with few of the protections or clear purposes of those at the very top. She was expected to be a Windsor, dignified, discreet, and deferential, but was given no defined role, no script to follow. Her rebellion in this light was not an act of petulance. It was a desperate, almost primal search for identity. A royal observer from that era noted she was one of the first to really struggle with the minor royal problem. What do? You're not the heir, you're not the spare, you're an attachment. Her flight into the art world and the London night was a flight towards a place where she could be a noun, not an adjective. From this perspective, the media's role was not that of a watchdog, but of a predator. They saw a young woman exploring the boundaries of her life, as most young people do, and twisted it into a morality play for public consumption. They didn't just report on her life, they actively shaped it, creating a wild child persona and then hounding her until she began to fit the caricature. Her struggles were not a story to be covered, but a product to be sold. She was, in essence, a canary in the coal mine, one of the first celebrities of the modern era to experience the full destructive force of a media industry untethered from the old rules of deference and respect. But there is another argument, one that is less comfortable but equally compelling. This view holds that while the media was undoubtedly cruel, Lady Helen was not a passive victim. She was an agent in her own story. She made choices. She was a woman of immense privilege, blessed with wealth, connections, and access that most people can only dream of. She willingly embraced a hedonistic lifestyle and associated with people who were involved in a dangerous and illegal world. While she may not have been a drug dealer, she chose to fly close to that particular sun and must bear some responsibility for getting burned. A social commentator of the time put it more bluntly: you can't have it both ways. You can't enjoy the thrill and glamour of the high life, a life often fueled by drugs and excess, and then claim complete victimhood when it goes wrong. She wasn't a naive girl from the countryside. She was a sophisticated, intelligent woman who knew the world she was in and the risks it entailed. This perspective does not excuse the media's savagery, but it does insist on acknowledging her autonomy. Her story, in this light, is a cautionary tale about the seductions of a certain kind of freedom, a reminder that choices, especially for those in the public eye, have consequences. Ultimately, the truth of her story lies in the uncomfortable space between these two arguments. She was both victim and agent, a product of her circumstances and the author of her choices. And it is this very complexity that makes her story so significant, so much more than a forgotten royal scandal. Her life was a crucible in which many of the defining royal and cultural battles of the next 30 years were first forged. Her struggle with the minor royal problem is the blueprint for the challenges that would later face an entire generation of royals, from Beatrice and Eugenie to, most profoundly, Prince Harry. How do you forge a meaningful life when your primary identity is defined by your proximity to someone else? Lady Helen's messy, public, and painful attempt to answer that question was a harbinger of the existential crisis that continues to haunt the institution today. Furthermore, her trial by tabloid was a prelude to the tragedy of Princess Diana and a foreshadowing of the digital age, where every celebrity's life is subject to relentless, microscopic scrutiny. She was one of the first to discover that fame in the modern world is a Faustian bargain, one where the public feels entitled to every part of you, and the media is more than happy to serve it to them. Her story is a vital chapter in the history of the toxic relationship between fame, media, and the public's insatiable appetite for scandal. It is a story about the human cost of being a headline. But most importantly, it's a story that did not end in tragedy. It ended in a quiet, hard-won peace. Her life, therefore, serves as a crucial historical marker, a prelude to the royal crises and media battles that would later captivate the world. She was the test case, the unwilling pioneer who explored the perilous territory between royal duty and personal freedom. Having analyzed the complex arguments and the undeniable historical significance of her rebellion, we are left with one final question. What is the ultimate lesson of her story? Beyond the scandal, the analysis, and the historical context, we must seek the deeper, more human truth of her journey to understand the unique and powerful nature of her eventual triumph. What is the sound of a life reclaimed? It is not the roar of applause or the clamor of vindication. More often than not, it is silence, a quiet so deep and deliberate that it becomes in itself the most powerful statement of all. This is the space where Lady Helen Taylor now lives, not a space of defeat or surrender, but a kingdom of her own making, its borders fortified by wisdom, its laws written in the language of self-respect. Her story did not end in the tabloid flames of the 1990s. That was merely the crucible. Her real story, the one that truly matters, is the one that has been lived ever since, largely unseen and entirely on her own terms. Her journey holds a mirror up to the very evolution of the monarchy and celebrity in the modern age. She was an unwitting pioneer, a quiet revolutionary whose personal battles presaged the institutional crises that would follow. Think of the path she forged, a path walked in darkness so that others, years later, might see the way a little more clearly. The agonizing debate over the role of a minor royal, a life of service versus a life of personal fulfillment, is the very debate that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle would later place at the center of a global conversation. Helen lived that conflict in the lonely arena of her own youth, without a supportive spouse in the public eye, without a Netflix deal, without the language of mental health and toxic media that we now take for granted. She was fighting a modern war with old weapons, and the scars she bore were a map for those who came after. Her story is, in effect, a crucial prequel to the royal dramas of the 21st century. It is the story of the first crack in the facade of never complain, never explain. She did not complain publicly, but her life itself, her job, her fashion, her struggles, was a form of explanation, a testament to the fact that the old model was no longer sustainable. She demonstrated that a Windsor could be something other than a full-time working royal, that they could have a real job, a real passion, a real messy human life. It was a radical idea then. Now, it is central to the monarchy's desperate search for relevance. But perhaps her most profound and lasting legacy is in the lesson she offers about power. Her contemporaries, like Princess Diana, and her successors, like the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, chose to fight their battles in the public square. They used the media as a weapon, speaking their truth directly to the world, reclaiming their narrative by telling it themselves. It is a valid and often powerful strategy, but Helen chose a different path, a path that is in many ways more difficult and more mysterious, the path of strategic silence. She reclaimed her life not by speaking out, but by opting out. She understood perhaps earlier than anyone that to engage with the tabloid media is to play a game you can never win. The only winning move is not to play. Her silence was not weakness. It was an act of supreme control. It starved the beast. By refusing to give it new material, new drama, new quotes, she forced it to move on. She let the caricature of the wild child wither and die from neglect. And in the silence that it left behind, she quietly cultivated her real life. This choice came at a cost. The world never got to hear her side of the story in her own words. We can only infer her pain, her motivations, her journey back to wholeness. By choosing privacy, she relinquished the chance for public vindication. But what she gained was infinitely more valuable. She gained herself. She traded the fleeting satisfaction of a headline for the enduring peace of a life lived authentically, away from the distorted mirror of public opinion. And so, we are left with the quiet triumph of Lady Helen Taylor. Her story is a profound human drama that transcends the rarefied world of royalty. It is a story for anyone who has ever felt trapped by expectation, for anyone who has ever made mistakes in the full glare of judgment, for anyone who has had to fight to reclaim their own identity from the story the world wants to tell about them. We look back at the young woman with defiance in her eyes, dancing on the edge of a volcano in 1980s London, and we see not a wild child, but a searcher, a young woman searching for a sense of self in the only way she knew how. We see her fall, and we see her rise. But her rising was not a spectacular return to the stage. It was a quiet walk into the garden. The great rebellion of Lady Helen Windsor, in the end, was not the partying, the drugs, or the rock and roll lifestyle. That was just the noise, the chaotic prelude. Her true lasting act of rebellion was the radical, uncompromising, and deeply courageous decision to live a normal, happy, and private life. To find love, to raise a family, to pursue her passions, and to do it all on her own schedule, by her own rules. In a world that demands every piece of a famous life, she had the strength to keep the most important parts for herself. She did not escape her bloodline. No one ever can. But she escaped its chains. And in doing so, she found a freedom more real and more lasting than any headline could ever capture.